Okay, then we can move to the last presentation of this morning. Anyway, we come back to the difficult English-speaking Irish language.
Okay, no pressure on my accent then. We're getting rowdy. We're nearly at coffee time, so just bear with me for another few minutes. Okay, so I am a veterinary research officer based with the Department of Agriculture here in Dublin. My job day to day is carrying out postmortems on animals that come into our lab from our passive surveillance system and also from some targeted surveillance that we carry out. One of the frustrating parts of my job, and I'm saying one of them because I'm aware my bosses may be here, one of the frustrating parts of my job is that oftentimes we compile reports, we do a lot of work on these animals, and yet we have no context for what's actually going on the farm, what our reports mean to the vets that receive them, and what actions our reports shape on the farms. So to try and address that, I took the approach of looking at the patterns of mortality in young calves, and we focused on dairy calves. And there's a number of reasons for that, and I'll try and explain some of those to you now. As we all know, it's very important to recognise the disease process early, because that way you can mitigate and you can help prevent some of the negative consequences of it. The dairy industry in Ireland, I think, is particularly vulnerable at this time. It's undergoing a period of rapid expansion. Milk quotas have been abolished. Farmers are being advised to increase their production. And the way they're increasing their production is they're increasing the number of cattle they have on those farms. There's also changing work practices that are coming into farms in Ireland. We're getting subcontracting where calves are being moved to other farms for rearing purposes. So within this dairy industry, and it's a very important industry to this country because it is our flagship industry, it's the most important agricultural sector we have here. So within this, there are a lot of challenges that face it. And in particular, I think things like antimicrobial resistance and the health of young calves are two of the biggest things. So we see we're getting this intensification happening on these dairy farms. With that, we're likely to see increased disease unless we do something about it. And I think we have a chance to do something about it now at this stage. And with that increased disease, the easiest option for a farmer, the easiest option for a vet to try and combat that disease is to increase antibiotic usage. And we all know that that contributes to AMR. So this study, we set out with four main objectives in it. The first was to determine the mortality rates that are present in Irish dairy herds. We wanted to categorise and benchmark the herds that were in the country based on those mortality rates, and it's the mortality rates in young calves is where we started. And then to identify key risk factors on those farms that may be contributing to those mortality rates. And then we looked at, and I'll explain a little bit about this later on, the potential of generating a predictive model for calf survivability on the farms. Were there factors on the farms using data we already have that we could predict a calf's chance of surviving into the future? So really we were looking, were there new tools to answer these old questions we have and my frustration with reports. So the methods we used the AIM database. So the AIM database is the National Register of Calf Movements, Calf Births and Calf Deaths in Ireland. I pulled out of that database, I pulled out a set of 3.1 million calves. So these were born over in 2013, 2014 and the early part of 2015, and followed up what happened those calves from that database over the course of their lives. Also pulled out some herd level information just to try and put it into context, and I'll show you where that comes in later on. So the Irish dairy industry, it's seasonal calving pattern. Most of our calves are born in February, March of each year. You can see here the data for 2013, 2014, 2015. And you can see even in 2015, before the dairy quotas were removed, the numbers of calves were increasing. So this intensification is occurring. It's a real thing that's occurring. There are more calves on these farms, and there are more calves on these farms, particularly at certain months of the year. So with that, I think there comes a lot of risks. So that's why we decided to look at what's happening in these young calves. So, straight off, in this cohort of animals we looked at, these 3.1 million animals, the overall mortality rate in these calves was 7.6%. So that was irregardless of what age they died at. Now, when we drill a little bit further into that and look at the ages at which they died, and I just want to point out from this data set, we removed ones that died before they were 1 day of age. So we assume that the calves in these have all taken a breath at least. But we're reliant very much on the farmer to have recorded it properly on the register. So in the under 21 day of age, we see that there's almost 4% mortality occurring. And then when we look at calves 3 to 6 weeks of age, there's a further 1% of them dying. Now, I think this 3 to 6 week of age deaths are very important, because these are animals that the farmer has invested in. He's got them as far as 3 weeks and then they die. So these are very important, I think, economically on the farms, but also as disease risks on the farms. And then a further 1% of animals die before they reach 6 months of age. The sex of the animals. One of the problems with the dairy industry in all countries is that the male animals, they're really a byproduct. And we're trying to find ways of using them, but as you all know, that can be very difficult. And with those, we have the female animals that are very valuable. So we would expect that there would be quite a bit of difference between the mortality rates in these two sexes. And when we look at the figures, by the time they get to 18 months, which is where those figures on the far side of the screen are, over here, there is maybe about a 2% difference in mortality. But when we look at the very young age groups, so the 0 to 21 day age group, there's only a 1% difference in mortality there. And when you take into account that perhaps on some farms, and we don't know how widespread it is in this country, but perhaps on some farms there could be euthanasia of male calves going on, that difference in mortality rate isn't that much. The movements, and this is a bit of a tabloid slide, but it's just I want to show the point that our calves in Ireland move a lot. They're very mobile. They can move from farm to farm movements and through marts. And with that comes risks in terms of biosecurity and in terms of welfare. We worry about these calves, and somebody made a comment there earlier, the impact of subclinical disease in these animals that look apparently normal and then move to another farm, get sick on another farm and spread disease on another farm. So the more movements you have, the more likelihood that you could have this. So just to show you there, and again I say it's a bit of a tabloid slide, but there is one animal in this country who's still not dead that has moved over 50 times through his life. So he has seen more of the world than I have at this stage. And then the next part of it, we went in to try to categorise the herds. And this is where I think it becomes very interesting. What we were looking at, ways that we could implement change, ways that we could drive change. And in order to do that, you need to know the individual mortality rates on herds, because farmers will want to compare themselves to other farmers. But we need to find ways of giving them that information in a way that maybe they can change their practices and monitor the changes they put in place. So 27,000 dairy herds we looked at, and we grouped them according to the mortality rates of the calves that were born into those herds. And they were grouped into low mortality, which was less than 6%, medium 6 to 12, and high greater than 12%. So the results in this, we found that 3,500 of the 27,000 herds had mortality rates in excess of 12%. 745 herds had mortality rates greater than 12% in that 0 to 3 week category, and another 736 had mortality rates greater than 12% in the 3 weeks to 6 month category. So if you want to target herds, if you want to see the herds with the problems, these are those. We looked then to see what we actually see into our regional veterinary laboratories, into our lab service. And this was to see where all this work we're doing, was it relevant? So we were quite pleased with some of the outcomes of this. We see we see about 2.5% of all the calves that died in that group. We actually carried out postmortems on those calves. So we have very good data being generated there, but it's all about how we use that data and how we make it more relevant to the farmers and more relevant to the industry. Then the next part of this is the predictive part. Could we predict the farms where there was going to be trouble? And the focus of this work was all on one database. It was using that register database. And that is probably why we weren't as successful at this as we would have liked to have been. So we wanted to produce a model that classifies calves into survival periods. So what we looked at was the chances of calves surviving to 6 months of age on a particular farm. And again, we used the same data set. We pulled out some further outliers from it to allow the modelling to occur. And then we looked at what factors in that data set were we seeing on individual farms that were actually affecting the results. And the things we saw, and I think it's in common with some of the previous presentations here, we saw dam parity was important, how many calves the mother already had. The sex of the calf was an important factor. The number of movements that calf had in its lifetime is an important factor. The herd size, the number of dairy cows on the herd in particular, the breed of the calf, whether there were a Frisian type breed or whether they were a beef cross breed, and the date of birth of the calf. And this comes back to this glut of calves being born at a particular time of the year on these farms, and that's important. And we can't be certain of the reasons for that, but we assume that it's because that there's a huge disease risk on those farms at those times. The explanatory power of our model was low. I'm not a statistician, but the statisticians told me that we could only explain about 15% of the total variability in the model using this one database alone. But there are ways of improving that, and I'm going to show that just on my conclusion slide. So, to conclude, Irish dairy herds, they are changing. But it is possible to map that change, and it's possible to map that change using data we already have, data we are already collecting. That data is there, it's just a matter of finding ways of using it. Mortality rates between individual herds vary quite significantly. And I think that it's very important that farmers are aware what their mortality rate is and how that compares to other herds, how that compares to other herds of the same size, how that compares to other herds with the same management practices. This is real data that we have, that we could give to farmers, that we could really drive change with. And so it is possible, using data we already have, to target and define these herds. You see there from that, I'm able to tell you, just using this preliminary examination of this data, what are the mortality rates. There was 3,500 herds there with high mortalities. Where the AIM database, this is our national register database, where it falls down is we cannot define the type of disease that's on these farms. In order to do that, we need expertise. We need the pathology expertise, we need the diagnostic expertise. And this is a finite resource. And what I'm arguing here today is that we should be targeting this resource at the farms that need it. We should be using these resources wisely. We see a lot of submissions to our laboratories here in Ireland, but they're predominantly young animals. As the animals get older, we see less and less of them. Now, there are probably a number of reasons for this, and the likelihood is that a lot of them are logistical, that it's much easier to carry a small calf to the laboratory than a 500 kilo steer. And then the predictive value of this type of analysis, and this is something which I think this is where the future lies. This is big data. This is how we can use our data more wisely. If we were to use other data streams with that calf register data that I'm presenting, things like the veterinary prescription data, the farmer syndromic surveillance data. He might be able to make an accurate diagnosis every time, but he'll be able to tell you whether it was a respiratory disease problem or whether it was a gastrointestinal disease problem. A lot of farmers are using handheld devices now. Vets a lot of large animal vets are using handheld devices for their prescription data. So that data is being recorded there. It's just a matter of using it. Abattoir knackery data, so animals coming into abattoirs, the lesions that the post-mortem examinations there are seeing, the knackeries, when they pick up the dead animals from farms, if we were recording the reason that that animal had died, that becomes very valuable data in explaining what's going on these farms. And socio-economic data, things like how many farmers, whether the caretakers are male or female, there's all these things we can put together into this big data set. So to conclude, and my final take-home point from this is that the computer processing ability used to be the limiting factor in dealing with these things. That's no longer relevant. Computers now we can deal with any data size. And we're generating huge amount of data from all sorts of different sources. And what we need to do, and what I think our responsibility is as people dealing with these problems on farms, is that we should be asking that data the correct questions to assist in our decision making, to assist in the welfare of the animals, to assist in the biosecurity of disease on these farms. It's all about asking the data the right questions and then getting the expertise, the bioinformaticians, the statisticians, to put the answer together and then give it to us that we will be able to interpret the results. So that's it. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, because this is also a very take-home message that justify also all the investigations that were done, because we have a surveillance system that enable us to know what are the different diseases and in what categories, in what age. Then this help a lot the investigations that we have heard this morning. So therefore, I open the discussion. Kerstin.
Yeah, Kerstin Müller from the Free University in Berlin. I would like to know your ideas about should these data be available for the public? In Germany, we have a lot of problems with the database you used and the security of the data of the farms.
Yes, I think the privacy of the data is an important consideration here. And any time you bring up this type of analysis, it's the first thing that's thrown at you, is that you have to ensure privacy. But it is possible to group farms. It is possible to put types of farms together and to draw conclusions from that without compromising an individual's privacy. And I think that's very important information. And I think if that's explained to the owners of the data, the farmers themselves or whoever is supplying that data, if it's explained to them the benefits that could accrue from using their data in this particular responsible way, I think we would get more buy-in from them. The problem is that this is a hard concept to get across. And in order to get it across, you need to have some work done. You need to be able to show that you have done this analysis and now you have an outcome from it. And you need to start somewhere.
Yes.
Charlie Blackwood from Australia. Did you look at changes in farms from year to year, as in ones that were high continually or ones that improved, etc.?
Yeah, we did. And again, you have to understand this was a huge data set. I'm not a statistician, so I find it hard to get my head around it at times. But yes, we did. And what we saw is those, in most instances, those high mortality farms remained high mortality farms. So they were high, the calves born on those farms were high mortality for the 3 years of the study. Now, I think that's why when, the benchmarking of the farms becomes very important, because I would wager that a lot of these high mortality farmers don't realise they're high mortality farmers. And if you put in the movements that's occurring there, on top of that, the movements of their calves, sometimes a guy that's selling his calves at 2 weeks of age may not know that all these calves are dying in the next week,
Yeah, just a question, Joe Patton, Chagas. Given the data is so condensed, or the calving patterns are becoming so condensed now, a calving event at the beginning of February is probably not the same as a calving event at the end of February in terms of disease pressure, etc., etc. So would it be possible perhaps to maybe look at your data in the intervals at 2 weeks or weekly intervals perhaps? Because I think it's possibly an issue at farm level where infection pressure, especially with calving becoming more condensed, that is that a significant risk factor perhaps?
It's a very good question, and I agree with you. I think that is important. The problem we have with this type of database is that it's very hard. The more granular you get with it, the more you go down deeper into it, the more you're reliant on the individual that's filling it in to be accurate. So if you're relying to go down to that 2 weekly interval, you're relying on the farmer to be very accurate on his date of birth of that calf and to be very accurate at his mortality rate. And I think I had concerns about the accuracy of that. So that's why in this we didn't go down to that level. But I think there is a solution for that. And the solution to that is more technology on the farms. The use of, online registration of calves. That makes it easier for the farmer to register. So he's less likely to register his calves on a weekly basis. He's more likely to do it as soon as he sees the calf in the shed.
Okay, then if we don't have any other questions, then... is there another question, sir? No? Okay, then I would like to thank all the speakers. So we have excellent points. Excellent points that were brought up and excellent and challenging take-home message that we can think about in the future. Thank you very much.